honor and privilege to have Daniel Ellsberg here with us in person today. An equally wonderful honor that his papers are coming to our university's special collections and archives. This will be a treasure not just for historians and other researchers like me, but for generations of students to come. I can't honestly think of another person alive today whose life work has so much relevance to the life and death issues of our own time. The threat of nuclear war remains with us, and endless wars of American military intervention around the globe continue to be a major problem for us and the rest of the world. And Daniel Ellsberg's life was committed to both those issues. And as you know, one of the things that makes his life so interesting is that he was, as a consultant, as an analyst, and as within government itself, as an advisor to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. He was at the center of power and strategizing around nuclear war and the Vietnam War. And eventually, of course, he became, and as that insider, he was, of course, an ardent supporter of the Cold War, though not all the policies that were implemented to carry that out. And then he became, of course, an even more ardent outsider and critic and activist. I can't think of another person, again, to talk about the exceptional quality of his life, who had that kind of access and input at the higher circles of American power, and then took such an extreme course in threatening his entire career and facing potential life imprisonment to oppose the war. No one else, certainly at that level of access, with the highest security clearances, took that kind of personal risk. And it didn't just stop with his making available to the public the so-called Pentagon Papers, the 7,000-page history of decision-making around the Vietnam War, but in the decades that followed, he was committed to many causes, but perhaps especially to nuclear disarmament, and was arrested in acts of civil disobedience dozens of times. So it really is a great opportunity for us to have a chance to talk to him and ask questions. He says at the outset of his extraordinary memoir called Secrets, a memoir of the Vietnam War and the Pentagon Papers, as he looks back and tracks the progression of his thought about the war, he writes that at the beginning, as a consultant and a government official, he saw the war as a problem, and a problem to be solved. And then he spent 3 years in Vietnam in the mid-60s as a civilian working for the State Department to try to find a political solution to the war, not just a military one. And at that point, he began to see the war as a stalemate. And having come to that conclusion, the answer was really to find a way to exit that stalemate. But then, not too long after that, he came to see the war not just as not as a problem or a stalemate, but as a crime, really, that had to be exposed and ended as immediately as possible. So, it's that trajectory of thought is not actually completely exceptional. Millions of Americans went through a kind of similar trajectory. Initial support for the war in the early days, in the heyday of American exceptionalism in the 50s. As they learned more about the war, they began to see it as a kind of unsolvable problem or stalemate too. And then, as you know, by 1971, this poll showed that 58% of Americans concluded that the war was not simply a mistake, but was immoral. The difference being, of course, the risks that people are willing to take to do something about it. And his willingness to do that really stands out. So here's how I'd like to proceed. We want to try to save his voice a little bit because Dr. Ellsberg. He's Dr. Ellsberg, by the way. He did, along the way, get a Ph.D. in economics. So you can address him as Dr. Ellsberg. Lost the train of my thought there. But here's how we're going to proceed. To save his voice, because he's got many events this week, I want to involve as many of you as possible. So you're known to think about questions you might have. I'll remind you, keep your questions as brief as possible. And we do, I think, have a handheld mic coming, though it hasn't arrived yet. We'll try to get that to you. But in any case, shout it out. So what I'd like to do is start by just taking a few questions, 2 or 3 questions, giving Dr. Ellsberg a chance to respond to those, and then we'll take another set of questions, and I will use my own prerogative perhaps to interject a few of my own questions as we go. So let's just open it up. Yes, Justin.
Yes. So upon releasing the Pentagon Papers, were you sort of expecting this prolonged cynicism about the government and for it to permanently impact the people's relationship with the government? And do you think that cynicism is now justified?
Okay. Another question?
Chris?
Yeah.
My hearing is bad. I may have to ask you to repeat the questions.
Right.
Or I could go out in there and hear them a bit. Or should I do
That's
that?
good. I'll take them and I'll recast.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
What did you expect to happen immediately after you released the papers?
Okay, good. Come on, don't be shy. Yes.
Were you concerned when you gave copies of the papers to other people that they would then turn you in?
Okay. Why don't we start with this question? Again, what did you think would happen when you turned in the papers? Yeah. What were your expectations when you turned over the Pentagon Papers? What did you think would happen?
Well, I first gave them to the Senate. By the way, as you may have mentioned, I'm losing my voice. I have to speak as quietly as I can. No louder than I have to. Can you hear me in the back?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. If you can't, let me know and I'll try to speak quietly. I first gave them to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator William Fulbright, the Foreign Relations Committee, who promised me that he would hold hearings on them. And as a matter of fact, it's sort of like the current situation. He said, we don't need to use your name at all, anonymous whistleblower, because the papers spoke for themselves. And I said, I would prefer that. Definitely not to be known. The papers tell the story, 7,000 pages, and don't need a lot of explaining by me. But if you need to have me in there just to authenticate the chain of communications here, yes, these are the real papers, yes, I did them. I'm willing to do it. But he assured me that that would not be necessary. In the end, he backed off from doing that on the grounds that Nixon had convinced people that he was ending the war. He couldn't hold the hearings that he had planned to hold. His committee wasn't with him. Nixon on November 3rd, 1969, that's just 50 years ago right now, right? Isn't that right?
Almost.
69?
Yeah.
60, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, wow, the anniversary. Anyway, Nixon, well, on October 1st is when I started copying the Pentagon Papers, 50 years ago. So I did give them to Fulbright. But Nixon convinced people that he was getting out of the war. He was going to end the war with honor. And his committee, which was largely also Republican, although Democratic majority, was not in favor of holding hearings about pressing Nixon to get out sooner than he planned. So that backed off. The Cambodian invasion came along. Again, we thought, okay, he's not getting out. 400 campuses were on strike. It was closed down essentially because of the Kent State killing. And Cambodian, again, we thought he'll get them out. And I was working hard to decide with the staff which volume should we do first and how do you handle this and so forth. But again, that went away in the fall. And the campuses were quiet. In fact, I really ran into a lot of people commenting that there was a mysterious wave of Quaaludes. Ever hear of Quaaludes? No? How many people have heard of Quaaludes? All right. More or less how many have had them. They sounded kind of good. I would have liked to try them in a way, but they're not available anymore. But the campuses went away, were so quiet with these that some people called them infant lobotomies, that there was essentially no activity in the fall, even though campuses had given, in expectation of a repetition of the spring, had many said, you can work on the elections. In the fall, you can go out, we won't find you, things like that. Nothing happened. Eventually, I gave the papers then to a couple of other senators, Senator McGovern, Senator Mathias. Both of them backed off. McGovern was going to run for president, was persuaded that he couldn't be part of putting out secret documents, as he had promised me he would do. So I did give them to the New York Times without the expectation that they would use them, just in hopes. And they didn't tell me they were going to use them for reasons that's still not clear to me entirely. Because without their telling me they were going to use them, I went ahead with other approaches and tried Representative Pete McCloskey, and promised he would do it, and some others. But the Times did come out in June 13th, 1971, without having told me that they were going to do that. My expectation was, my wife and I were, who's here, sitting here now, were overjoyed when Saturday night, June 12th, midnight, when the papers came to the kiosk at Harvard Square, the Sunday paper, and I got it with his headline. At last, this thing I'd been trying to get out for 2 years was out. But the simple answer to the question is, I expected to go to prison for the rest of my life. It was 7,000 pages of top secret. I didn't know of any prior prosecutions, and that's another subject, but I assumed there had been some. And nobody I knew had done 7,000 pages, so they were going to throw the book at me, as he did. I was put on trial for a possible 115 years in prison, 12 felony counts. But it didn't end quite there, because in fact tonight there's going to be a rather historic gathering for the first time in, this started in 48 years, I guess, since 71. Namely, in a way I won't have time to go into now, but hinted at in the movie, I became aware in the course of giving the papers to the Washington Post, the Times having been enjoined for the first time in our history. A paper was forbidden to publish something prior to publication. The First Amendment was designed rather specifically to avoid that. And so for the first time, they experimented with an injunction that would stop a newspaper from publishing. So I was giving them to the Washington Post. In the course of doing that, turned on the TV at the motel where I was transferring them to Ben Bagdikian of the Washington Post. Anybody here seen the movie The Post? Well, you may remember Ben Bagdikian on that, making phone calls to somebody, a Mr. Boston, representing me to get the papers for the Post. Because we then saw that the FBI was at our door at that moment. So we couldn't go home. We called a friend of ours who will be here tonight, Janaki Chanro, to see if she could help us stay underground for a while here while I put out the rest of the papers. And the upshot was that for the next 13 days, with the help of Janaki and Gar Alperovitz, who will be here tonight, we put out these papers to 17 other newspapers altogether, 19 altogether. So many that they stopped issuing injunctions after 4. They said it was like herding bees, so they couldn't control them. Supreme Court then, as the movie ends, shows the press is running again with the Supreme Court having voided the injunction and said the papers could publish, but the movie doesn't mention what happened essentially the same day, which was that I was indicted for criminal affairs, and that went on for the next couple of years. So, to sum up, the expectation was I would be in prison, and by miraculous circumstances, it didn't work out that way.
As you know, there was a mistrial because in the middle of the trial, it was discovered that
End of the trial.
Kissinger and Kissinger and Nixon had authorized the so-called plumbers to attack Daniel Ellsberg to try to discredit him. Let me just ask a question now. I'm sure I know many of you are curious to know how Daniel Ellsberg made the transition to take against the war in such a powerful way. And how did he come to the willingness to face a life imprisonment? And one part of the answer can be explained by the presence of a guest here who I didn't know was going to come, but Randy Keeler, who's swayed in the front row, was someone that Dan met in 1969, I believe it was. And I'll just preface it by saying that Randy Keeler was he graduated from college, he was 22 years old, he did everything possible to resist the draft. He didn't want he didn't want to leave for Canada, he didn't want to try to get exemptions, he didn't want to get conscientious objector status, all alternatives that he might have taken, but he took a more principled stand that I find the war so deeply immoral. If you're going to force me to fight it, I just won't go. Send me to prison. So he did indeed spend 2 years in prison. And it was just before he was heading off to prison that Dan met him. So you can take it from there.
Okay. Well, a broader, something that I think is quite relevant to this audience. As a matter of fact, it occurs to me to ask, how many people here are under 18? Under 18. Can I see hands? How many people here are under the age of 18? Nobody? Really? Everybody's over 18?
It's mostly 18 to 22.
What?
Mostly 18 to 22.
Okay, because I was just thinking, well, let's say, how many are under 20? Okay, the interest of that being that since you were 2, and may not have been paying attention to the evening news too much, since you were 2, we've been at war in Afghanistan all your lives. No Americans like Randy and my wife had an experience any like that when I was 18. Our longest war, I'd lived through World War II when I was 10 to 14. Civil War, it lasted a few years, comparable amount of time. World War I, we were involved for about a year altogether for us. So for 18 years, we have been killing people in Afghanistan, American troops, men and women now, and being killed by them at a much, much lower rate. And that war is so like Vietnam, it could be going on 15 years from now, or when you have children, perhaps. Just an astonishing situation in some ways. So it may be our future. Now, the Vietnam War did not have to end in 1975. I would say that after Nixon ran in 1972, a year after the Pentagon Papers, the year that the Watergate burglars were captured in the Watergate. In January of 73, after a landslide election, an unprecedented landslide election, I knew, and that's why I'd given the Pentagon Papers, that the war would not end while Richard Nixon was in office. It didn't, by the way. And even though his term in office was shortened, I was convinced that he would keep the war going, at least with American air supporting Vietnamese troops, as long as he was in office. And he would be supporting President Thieu. He showed that very clearly in negotiations. So long as he was in office, from reasons that were rather mysterious to most people at the time, even in the White House, he was unwilling to concede what the North Vietnamese demanded, that a coalition government not include Nguyen Van Thieu. And Thieu did, in fact, last longer than Nixon. The point being, I would have said that ending the war, that as of early 73, Nixon for 4 more years, landslide victory, the chance of his being out of office was 0. It has never acted, I just learned last night, it has never happened in history that an American president has been involuntarily removed by impeachment. There have been impeachments, but they did not lead to Nixon resigned, facing impeachment, but that was because he was, contrary to his last words, a quitter. And it's almost his last words were, "I am not a quitter," but that was as reliable as, "I am not a crook." You don't remember those famous words, but that was as reliable as Donald Trump's assertions at that time. The point being, it was impossible that Nixon would be out of office before 1977, and that meant to me, and in retrospect I was right, it was impossible the war would end before 77. We had stopped bombing while American troops were being withdrawn, but Nixon's plan was to, and Kissinger's was to continue the bombing as soon as the troops were out. And the order had been given to do that, actually, in April 1973. It had to be rescinded because of my trial, which is another matter. But the way I get to the point here is this. We had, at that time, an anti-war movement involving not just demonstrations and petitions and individual acts of civil disobedience, but a movement of nonviolent Gandhian, Martin Luther King type civil disobedience, like the sit-ins in the South, or the sit-ins that organized the auto industry in Detroit, by the way, in the 30s. An organized movement that, as far as I know, no other country has ever seen. Chris, you're the historian on this. Is there really an analogy to the draft resistance of the United States?
Not on that scale, no.
On that scale, I don't think so. So by 69, maybe it was later, but at some point, we had 5,000 people in prison, men at those days, only the men were subject to the draft. A new draft would involve women. But that's what the movement against sexism, and one of the products of that. But about 5,000 in prison, 50,000 had been subject to court process to some degree, and hundreds of thousands had failed to return their draft cards or to cooperate with the draft. 50,000 had been subject to some kind of court process. And it so happened that in August of 1969, and now we're in this area exactly 50 years ago, I went to the meeting of the War Resisters League, a movement of conscientious objectors, which didn't exist legally in the First World War, but which grew up largely of resistors from the First World War. Albert Einstein had been its honorary president for years. And people had been resistors in the Korean War and in the Second World War. They were having a meeting from all over the world, and there was a young man who addressed them at one point, who I'd met recently and had been very impressed by. Just met him briefly. But he was organizing the conference at Haverford, Pennsylvania. And as he addressed the group on about the third day or so of the conference, I was sitting there thinking, I'm glad that the people from all over the world, India, Japan, Vietnam, Buddhists from Vietnam, Europe, were hearing this young man because he's as good as we've got. He's the best. He's a great representative of America, and I'm glad that he's hearing him. And in the midst of it, I heard him say that he was on his way to prison, which I had not known. In fact, most of the people at the conference had not known beforehand. He was awaiting trial, and shortly his trial did send him to prison after a while, for a couple of years. And I was absolutely stunned by this information, which I had not seen coming. And I'm not sure that any of my colleagues in the Defense Department of the Rand Corporation, and all of my friends were Marines, Defense Department, all had clearances. I doubt if any one of them had ever met a draft resistor. And the two worlds were just entirely separate. You didn't go to demonstrations, even plenty of people against the war, Plenty of people who could watch demonstrations and say yes in front of their TV, but not being photographed at that demonstration, and simply didn't meet anybody. So here was somebody who had been to Harvard, as I had, was now a graduate student, and I was seeing somebody that was an exemplary American. And the best thing he could do at that moment was to go to prison, not to Sweden or be a conscientious objector or join the National Guard like George W. Bush, least of all, obviously, but get a deferment and so forth. But to go to prison to make the strongest possible statement that the war was wrong, that it was wrong to participate in it voluntarily, and to make that statement as strongly as it possibly could be made, as Thoreau put it, from inside a jail cell, that he could be heard more strongly. And not one of them, of course, the people doing this, imagined that they would end the war, or even, affect the war. It was just the best thing they could do at their point in their life, the strongest thing they could do. And actually it was very powerful because I felt that power on my own life. And not to go on longer about it, I guess it's in the movie, but they're not going to see the movie tonight. I actually went to a men's room at the back of the auditorium like this one, it was a big auditorium, and sat down by myself and just cried for a long time. The only other time I can remember hysterically crying like that uncontrollably was when Bobby Kennedy died. And at the thought that this is what my country had come to, that the best thing that a young American could do was to go to prison. And it made me think, my son is born for prison. He was 14 then, I think. And indeed, the war was still going on when he turned 18. And he turned in his draft card. And eventually Nixon stopped the draft because of the protest. Okay, one of the proudest moments in my life, a couple of years ago, was I was in Dresden getting work. Ed Snowden was on Skype from Moscow and made the statement to the audience, without Dan Ellsberg, no Ed Snowden. And he's referring to the fact that the movie they're going to show tonight to some people, and I encourage you to see it, The Most Dangerous Man in America, he had seen while he was considering what to do. And it had strengthened him, he said, in the thought that he should be willing to go to prison and to do what had to be done. Well, there's no question in my mind, without Randy Keeler, no Dan Ellsberg. And what is that worth? Well, briefly, and it's a long story, and I'll just say the bottom line. Putting out the Pentagon Papers did not end the Vietnam War. It did not even attenuate the violence. A year later, in 1972, was the heaviest bombing of the war. And at the end of that year, the Christmas bombing of Hanoi. I was convinced at that point, a year into my trial, that the entire anti-war movement had accomplished nothing. And in terms of affecting Nixon's policy, that was true. It had not affected his policy. And yet, I'm talking now early 73, and yet within months, Nixon was facing impeachment, had to resign. It took a year, a process from the discovery of Watergate. In fact, his election lay between that in 72. But it did bring him out of office, and that made the war endable. Now, the Pentagon Papers by themselves would have had no effect on that. But Nixon was so concerned that I had other information about his threats, backing up his secret plan, and he did have a secret plan. And he carried it out, and it almost won. Maybe we'll get into that in the rest of it. But The discovery of the burglary, the initial burglary led to the discovery of his acts against me in particular, including trying to incapacitate me totally, physically, on the steps of the Capitol, which I have been saying lately, like yesterday, would be, I'm afraid, the fate of this whistleblower if Donald Trump believes that he has more information, or she, and I hope it's a she, because everybody's been assuming that he's here all the time. If Donald Trump believes this whistleblower, as Nixon believed Daniel Ellsberg, has further information to put out at him. Nixon brought up 12 CIA people to incapacitate me. Donald Trump wouldn't have that. He wouldn't do that. He would just continue doing what he's already done, calling on his vigilante supporters to take care of this troublesome person for him. I think it's very important for the safety of this current whistleblower to remain anonymous from being incapacitated. Totally, although I very much suspect that if they have to be identified as part of the process, they will do it, the courage they've shown already. Well, so say the crimes that Nixon took against me in particular, going into my doctor's office to get information to blackmail me with, to keep me from telling more information, coming to incapacitate me, doing CIA profiles on me illegally to see what my vulnerabilities might be to manipulation. All of these were then crimes. Not now, by the way, since 9/11. But at that time he had to keep them secret, and he did by paying people off not to testify about them. None of that would have brought him down if John Dean had not chosen to tell the truth about the president, which is never safe to do. John Dean was under protective custody and needed it. Dean's word was against the president. The president, people believed the president without documents. Nothing would have happened after John Dean's testimony incriminating Nixon, except that another man who was one of a handful who knew that Nixon had taped himself told that, absolutely unpredictably, end of his career in any kind of government, some Air Force colonel, Alex Butterfield. If he hadn't told, Nixon would have stayed in office and the war would have continued. If Elliot Richardson, the Attorney General, had not refused orders to fire the special prosecutor and had to resign, and then if Reckleshouse, who replaced him, had not also refused, and then a third person, Bork, who came in, did fire, and so the special prosecutor goes out the same night, 3 people, the Saturday Night Massacre. Had they not taken those absolutely unpredictable steps, because these were people who had done everything the president ever expected them to do, this would have gone on. So the end of this is, there was a long chain of people having to do things that they were not expected to do, because it was risky for them. In each case, and that wasn't the end of it, I could name 50 people maybe, and each one was necessary. None were sufficient. Nobody, Dean by himself testifying in front of Watergate, would have had no effect without Butterfield. Butterfield, no effect without Supreme Court justices appointed by Nixon going against him unanimously. Treason, as Trump would call it. And there was this chain of which Patricia and I were part, and which Randy Keeler here was a crucial part before me. The war would have continued. So each of those people played an essential role. Maybe there's 50, maybe there's 100 in ending the war. And in probably almost no case would anyone have predicted that that person would be the one. I think just conceivably Randy might have been predicted from his background, but not me. And so this is what you can do at your age. How old were you, Randy, when you went in '69?
I was 25.
25, you're a graduate student. 25. Anyway, not too old. Well, we're seeing what Greta Thunberg can do, what a 16-year-old girl can do when she was 15. So that's the challenge.
Let's hear a few more questions. And we have a mic here if you'd be willing to come up, or maybe we'll carry it to you. Please. Somebody else who hasn't spoken. Yes.
By the way, no women are asking us.
Yeah, we would want.
Yeah. Oh, what was her question?
Yeah.
I was wondering, Dr. Ellsberg, about the Espionage Act and how that's used against whistleblowers.
Louder, please.
I was wondering whether Dr. Ellsberg thought about the Espionage Act and how it's used against whistleblowers.
The Espionage Act, which they used.
What about it?
What would you think of it? Whether it's
Like how it's used against whistleblowers.
how it's still being used?
You know, Bernie Sanders just last week has made a statement that no American politician has ever made. And he said, if I'm president, I will not use the Espionage Act to prosecute leakers. And any president could do that. No one before Nixon had ever done it. And that's not because there were no leaks. The Espionage Act was not intended for leaks, it was intended for spies, giving information secretly to a foreign power, especially an enemy, start of war. No president had experimented. We have no law against leakers. We have a First Amendment, which Britain doesn't have, and we don't have an Official Secrets Act, which Britain does have, precisely for that reason. And the Espionage Act then was an experiment by Nixon to see if he could find an act that they could use. And the wording of it does allow it, except that using that, in the best legal opinion, is that it's unconstitutional if you use it that way. Strict liability. So what could be done, and I wasn't thinking of an executive doing this, or any president, frankly. Obama came in promising the most transparent administration ever, and used the Espionage Act 3 times more than all previous presidents together. Now, that figure is a small one, 3 before Obama. I was the first. His was 9 or 10, depending on how you count the traits as a leaker.
Question, since we're getting down to time, I'd be curious if you could.
But the act should be, and the act should be changed by Congress to make assure that it allows for a public interest defense or a necessity defense, which it no longer does not at this point, so that someone held, if anyone should be held accountable, and it's not clear we need to hold anyone criminally accountable for giving information to the American public. Our republic survived the Civil War, and the World War I, World War II, without any such prosecutions and with plenty of leaks during that time. So do you need a law for this? No. But if you're going to have a law, it's got to be a law different from the Espionage Act that will allow people to say, here is why I did it, which I was not allowed to say. Here was the potential benefit, here was the actual benefit, here was the harm, here was the actual harm. None of that can be said now. So it's an outrageous situation where it is now criminal, the way the act is used, to reveal criminality that is classified. And criminality will be classified. You notice, bring it right up to the present, 12 people hear the president commit a crime, a crime of abuse of power on the phone talking to the president of Ukraine. Not one of them tells him to draw back, change it, correct this. No, they lock it up, though it wasn't classified, but in the most classified system. So now it is classified, although it had no criteria for that before, except the usual one, embarrassment to the president. I don't think you can embarrass Donald Trump by impeaching him or anything else, but they were worried that it might embarrass them to be working for a guy such a crook. And so they locked it up. That means that the people who leaked it to the press, that this complaint existed now, were, in the eyes of the Justice Department, committing a crime against the Justice Department. And they would not be able to say, but I was revealing a crime. Irrelevant. It was classified. It's an absurd situation. So that has to change.
Dan, let me ask you this. Why does the government keep so many secrets, and how many of them are necessary to keep?
Well, an estimate, could you hear that? A man named William F. Florence testified at our trial under oath, having just retired a month earlier from being in charge of security regulations in the Defense Department for 30 years. There was no one who knew more about the system than he did. And he had testified the following thing already, that's how we heard of him, to a government committee after retiring. So we called on him to testify, and he said, you know, we have 3 known categories of classification: confidential, secret, top secret. Those are actually the lowest levels. The real secrets are higher clearances. But there are billions of pages of those. He said about 5% justify classification at the time they are stamped, fulfill the actual criteria of danger to the United States. 5%. He said after 3 years or 4 years, about 1/10 of that, half of 1%. 1 out of every 200 pages, which is a lot of pages when you have 1 billion pages to start with. So yes, there are things that deserve secrecy, about half of 1% if they're 3 years old, maybe 5% otherwise. Notice that what has just been locked up in the highest security, which is higher than top secret, the code word, meaning words higher than top secret, what's just been classified was the transcript that has now been released. And they've also mentioned that along with that, in the same safe, or actually it's a server, digital, are his conversations with Putin and with Turkey, Erdogan.
Yeah.
Potentially embarrassing to someone who could be embarrassed.
Right.
And that's what the secrecy system is for, essentially. Yes, there is a not insignificant function of keeping information from foreign powers. As I say, 5% is a lot of pages. But most of it is secret because it's potentially embarrassing. And here's something that's not obvious. Why do they classify everything and hold on to it forever? The answer is you don't know what will be embarrassing in a few years. You make a prediction, you announce a program, which one will turn out to be total disasters, which predictions will be embarrassingly wrong, which will look like crimes. Not to you, like the president, but maybe to somebody else, like everybody else. You don't know how that's going to look. So you classify everything, and you keep it classified. That's the system it has. It is not compatible with democracy. It's an anti-democratic system which, to some degree, may be necessary to function. But I say it's a tiny degree. Classify it isn't that they classify so much altogether, because most of it doesn't turn out to be significant at all. But they classify nearly everything the public ought to know in terms of holding their officials accountable. And that makes democracy impossible.
Good. Maybe a brief answer to one more question. Unfortunately, we're going to have to close, but
When do you close?
you just in like 3 minutes. But in the Pentagon Papers, I think I mentioned this to you, when Dan Ellsberg was helping to collect them, he was one of the very few people that actually read them and read them all. So it's an impossible question to end on, but could you just name 1 or 2 things that you discovered when you read them that you found particularly shocking, that you hadn't really known about?
Yeah, well, I didn't have to read the part about 64, 65 because I had been in the Pentagon with total access, almost total access. It's funny, let me see if I can do this in 3 minutes. I was going to say that I learned nothing when the Pentagon Papers were put. I learned very little about the period from 64 on when I'd been involved. I knew that stuff. Actually, what was not in the Pentagon Papers were documents from the White House that had not been available to the Pentagon Papers, and we didn't know we didn't have them available. We didn't know they existed. And what they were kept out of the struggle, like this embarrassing telephone call, were the warnings by the highest officials, second highest, second man in the Defense Department, second man in the State Department, saying, this is catastrophic. Do not do this. There is no way to succeed. It's terrible. Those were held so closely that we never saw them in the Pentagon Papers. And had I read those before I went, I wouldn't have gone to Vietnam. I'd never seen a critique that clear. I have no doubt that the Pentagon Papers of Syria, or Turkey, or Iraq, or Iran, Somalia, Sudan, in every case would show written warnings saying, do not do what you're doing, because it's illegal, it's criminal, it's dangerous, it's murderous, it's killing lives to no effect, exactly like the Pentagon Papers. And people don't put it out knowing that they agree with that statement, as in Vietnam. It's terrible. But if I break my promise of secrecy, I will be called a rat and a snitch by the president and agreed by many other people. I'll be thought of as a traitor. I lose my clearance. I lose my job. I have to move to a different part of the country that is not involved in Defense Department contracts, et cetera, et cetera. And that keeps just about everybody except Chelsea Manning and Ed Snowden from putting out large amounts which are necessary. And 100 other people, like whistleblowers, take a less risky route, like this current one, but not enough, not nearly enough. So what I learned, in other words, was that we ran a secret foreign policy, could call it a covert foreign policy, plausibly deny that we have an empire, plausibly deny who runs it and to what interests, why it's run, and what we're doing in the way of torture, assassination, covert operations, plans of all kinds. That aspect of the foreign policy which defines it. Who are our real allies? Give one little example. Before Putin, who was the greatest demon in the world aside from Osama bin Laden? Assad of Syria, again, a great demon. Except that under George W. Bush, while he was a demon, we were sending people secretly to be tortured by the Syrians because they did it better than we did. Consciously to the Syrians, including total false alarms, misidentified people that were the wrong people. Is that our enemy or secretly an ally, etc.? By the way, it'll take a lot of documents to convince me the following point. We're sending tanks to Syria to protect the oil. That's all explicit. Now, in the absence of a UN Security Council directive to do that, I don't see that as anything but a crime against peace. It's aggression, like what we did to Iraq, like what the Russians did in going into Kuwait, etc. It seems like I haven't heard that mentioned by anybody. But second, to protect the oil from whom? For whom? For protected from the Syrians? Assad? Yeah, we're against Assad. From the Turks? From the Kurds? I have no idea who we're protecting. Does Congress know? Does Nancy Pelosi know? Does Mitch McClellan know? So, talk about a secret foreign policy. Does the president know why he's doing this? Whose suggestion is he following? Well, we know Lindsey Graham. Okay. Anyway, we have a problem here, right?